Welcome to another deep dive. We are incredibly glad you are here with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us.
If you've been following along with our explorations, you know we love taking a stack of research, articles, or in today's case, a remarkably dense theological document, and just pulling out the most critical insights for you.
Yeah, and today's source is definitely a fascinating one.
It really is. We're diving into a document simply titled Mat24pivot.docs.
Right.
And our mission for this time together is to explore a profound, honestly somewhat jarring shift in the Gospel of Matthew, specifically focusing on chapter 24.
Because when most people think about the biblical end times, the mind immediately jumps to those big cosmic signs.
Oh, exactly. We picture blood moons, global
It's
catastrophes.
the grand cinematic spectacles Hollywood loves.
Yeah, the blockbuster stuff.
Yeah.
But our goal today is to look at a terrifyingly relatable concept found right in the middle of this ancient text. It's about the suddenness of judgment arriving while humanity is just going about its completely normal day.
And that shift in focus is exactly what makes this source document so compelling. It takes the traditional pop culture view of the apocalypse and completely subverts it. I mean, everyone naturally wants to map out a timeline of disasters. We look for patterns.
We want a schedule.
Exactly. But the analysis we're looking at today highlights how the biblical text actually warns against that urge. It shifts the theological focus away from a neat calendar of global catastrophes and places it directly onto the psychology of everyday human life.
Before we get too far into the weeds, I do want to clearly set the stage for you. We are going to be hyper-focused on this specific transition in the text, this move from looking outward for global signs to the much more insidious danger of everyday complacency.
Which is an important distinction to make.
It is. Now, the source document does touch on the later parables in Matthew chapter 25, which deal heavily with watchfulness and faithfulness. You might be familiar with the parable of the 10 virgins or the parable of the talents,
Right, those are very well known.
but we're actually not going to dwell on those today.
No, we're saving those for a completely separate deep dive. The theology there really deserves its own dedicated time.
Completely agree. Today is strictly about the pivot itself in chapter 24 and the human perspective of sudden judgment. So with that boundary set, okay, let's unpack this.
To genuinely understand the wisdom of this pivot, we first have to establish what Jesus is pivoting away from.
Right.
The first block of Matthew chapter 24, specifically verses 4 through 25, functions essentially as a catalog of massive, observable, historical, and global events.
Jesus is warning his disciples about the severe trials to come.
Yes. In verse 6, he talks about hearing of wars and rumors of wars. In verse 7, he mentions nations rising against nations alongside famines and earthquakes in various places.
And by verse 9, he's warning about the direct, violent persecution of believers.
Exactly.
And then, in verses 15 and 16, he brings up a phrase that sounds incredibly cryptic to modern ears. He talks about the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place.
Yeah, that's a heavy one.
For a first-century Jewish listener, that wasn't just a spooky, abstract phrase, was it? They carried deep historical trauma.
It carried massive trauma. The abomination of desolation was a direct callback to the prophet Daniel, but also to a very real, horrific historical event.
Right, about 2 centuries earlier.
Roughly 2 centuries earlier, yeah. The Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes had desecrated the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. He set up an altar to Zeus and literally sacrificed a pig on it.
Which was the ultimate desecration of their sacred space.
It was. So when Jesus uses that specific phrase, he's invoking a visceral, horrifying image. He's telling them to look out for undeniable, earth-shattering events. If a war breaks out or an earthquake levels a city or the temple is overtly desecrated, you notice it.
You can point to it. It's undeniable. But human psychology does something incredibly strange with undeniable warnings.
It really does.
It's like driving a car with your check engine light on.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. The very first day that light illuminates on your dashboard, it is terrifying. You drive slowly, you listen to every little sound the engine makes, and you plan to go to the mechanic immediately.
But then you don't.
Exactly. If the car keeps running, by month 6, that glowing red light is just part of the dashboard illumination. You've completely normalized the warning sign right up until the day the transmission drops out onto the highway.
What's fascinating here is how the source document describes those exact types of events. It categorizes the wars, the famines, and the earthquakes as seasonal indicators.
Seasonal indicators, I like that.
Yeah, they show that a shift in the era is approaching, but they explicitly do not give anyone a calendar date. Jesus makes this clear in verse 33. He says, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near at the doors.
So they're meant to keep the observer alert, but they cannot be used to pinpoint the exact moment of the end.
Precise.
Which leads us directly into the verse that completely flips the script. After spending over 30 verses laying out all these intense, observable, global events, Jesus suddenly hits the brakes.
It's a very sharp turn.
Verse 36 is the critical turning point in this entire discourse. I'll read it right from the text. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only.
That single verse represents a massive psychological whiplash for the listener.
Whiplash is the right word for it.
To fully appreciate why this matters so much, you have to put yourself in the shoes of those early Jewish Christian readers. Think about their theological toolkit at that specific moment in history.
Which was pretty limited compared to what we have now.
Exactly. They didn't have the book of Revelation yet, with its intricate descriptions of seals, bowls, and trumpets. They didn't have the Apostle Paul's letters, like 1 Thessalonians, explaining the timeline of the Lord's return.
They were operating solely on the Hebrew scriptures and the teachings of Jesus that they had either heard directly or that were being circulated among the early churches.
Which meant any framework they were going to build about the end of the age had to rely entirely on what they could observe and what Jesus had just told them.
Right.
So when Jesus drops verse 36, stating unequivocally that no one knows the day or the hour, not even the angels, it forces a total paradigm shift. You can no longer just be a passive observer sitting back with a checklist of earthquakes and political upheavals, waiting for the final box to be ticked.
The text forces a move from charting the global signs to maintaining constant internal vigilance.
Exactly. Because the truly terrifying element isn't just the earthquakes or the wars.
The scary part is the suddenness.
Yes.
And to explain the nature of that suddenness, Jesus uses an analogy that forms the absolute core of our deep dive today. He puts back to the days of Noah.
Let's look at that.
Let me read from Matthew 24, verses 38 and 39. For as in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away.
It is such a vivid picture, but it completely contradicts how we usually expect divine judgment to look.
Right.
When we think of a society ripe for apocalyptic destruction, we imagine total anarchy, fire in the streets, and rampant visible evil.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The text goes out of its way to emphasize the sheer banality of their actions. It highlights how entirely normal life felt to these people.
Yes, normal.
They weren't necessarily engaged in cartoonish, over-the-top villainy at that exact moment. Jesus doesn't mention murder or theft here. He mentions eating dinner. He mentions hosting weddings. They were just doing the completely ordinary things that human beings do to keep society running.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the contrast between human oblivion and God's timeline is staggering. Our source document draws a brilliant line back to the Old Testament to highlight this.
Oh, right. Back to Genesis.
Yeah. From God's perspective, there was a fixed, unyielding timeline. Back in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, God had already set a 120-year countdown to the flood.
So the schedule was locked in.
It was completely locked in. Furthermore, we know from 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, that Noah was a herald of righteousness. He was actively warning the people around him.
He wasn't building the ark in secret. You can't quietly construct a massive wooden ship on dry land.
Right. It would have been a colossal public works project.
It was impossible to ignore. So you have a society that is literally watching a giant ark being constructed day after day, year after year.
They are undoubtedly hearing Noah's warnings.
The timeline is fixed by God, and yet the human oblivion is total.
We see the ultimate example of normalcy bias at work here. The people lived their lives completely unconcerned because the disaster hadn't happened yet. They were entirely oblivious to the impending destruction right up until the water hit their ankles.
That brings up a critical insight from the source document that challenges a lot of modern pop culture theology.
It really does.
In verse 39, Jesus says, "The flood came and took them all away." Then, in the very next verse, verse 40, he applies this pattern to the future, saying, "Then 2 men will be in the field, one is taken and one is left."
This is a huge point of debate.
It is. For decades, popular media, think of the Left Behind books and movies, has conditioned people to read the word taken as a positive rescue. The idea is that the righteous are quietly taken away to heaven while the wicked are left behind to suffer.
But the source document points out that the immediate context of the passage demands the exact opposite interpretation.
How so?
Well, the Noah analogy establishes the pattern.
Hmm.
In the days of Noah, who was taken?
The complacent people were taken. They were swept away by the floodwaters of judgment.
Exactly. And who was left?
Noah and his family were left behind on the earth, safe in the ark.
Therefore, the document notes that the word taking in verse 40 actually means removal in judgment. It's not a secret rescue mission. It's the sudden, forceful removal of those who were lulled to sleep by the illusion of normalcy.
That completely flips the paradigm.
It really does.
The ones who are taken are the ones who are caught up in the routine of eating, drinking, and marrying. They're the ones who ignored the check engine light.
Yes.
But honestly, this brings up a massive logical objection, and it's one our source document addresses head on. If you are reading Matthew 24, and Jesus has just spent 30 verses listing off famines, wars, earthquakes, and violent persecution, how on earth could people be living normally?
It is a great question.
How are people throwing lavish weddings and casually eating and drinking in the middle of a global tribulation? It feels like an unsolvable paradox.
It does feel contradictory on the surface, but that paradox assumes that everyone on Earth is experiencing that tribulation period in the exact same way. The source document provides brilliant insight here by pulling back the lens and looking at how humanity is divided during this time, particularly through the lens of the book of Revelation.
Okay, let's look at that division.
The broader biblical narrative splits humanity into two primary camps during the end of the age. You have the persecuted saints and the beast worshippers.
The persecuted saints are obviously the ones experiencing the severe trials, the famines, and the martyrdom Jesus warned about. But let's clarify that second group. Calling them beast worshippers sounds like something out of a fantasy novel.
Yeah.
What does that actually look like in the context of the text?
In the context of Revelation, worshiping the beast isn't just about bowing down to a monster. It is about buying into a global economic and political system.
Right.
Revelation 13 explicitly ties allegiance to the beast with the ability to buy and sell. So this second camp will actually be experiencing a time of perceived prosperity and economic security.
They will be confident.
Very confident. They will see the same global events, the same wars and earthquakes, but their internal narrative will be, the system is working, our leaders have it under control, everything is fine.
They have bought into the illusion of safety because their bank accounts are full and the grocery stores are stocked.
Precisely.
They are the modern equivalent of the people watching Noah build the ark while picking up their dry cleaning and planning a dinner party.
That's exactly it. The system provides them with a comforting rhythm that drowns out the warning signs. And the source material uses the fall of Babylon in Revelation chapter 18 as the ultimate biblical illustration of this.
That suddenness, shattering the illusion of economic safety.
Yes.
Revelation 18 is a chilling chapter. The imagery of the global merchants weeping because no one is buying their luxury goods anymore is incredibly stark.
It's a total economic collapse.
And the document highlights a repeated phrase in that chapter that really drives home the theme of suddenness. 3 different times, in verses 10, 17, and 19, the text repeats the exact same terrifying verdict. In 1 hour, your judgment has come.
1 hour.
1 hour. That is breathtakingly fast for the collapse of a global superpower.
And look at what is specifically being destroyed in that single hour. Revelation 18, verses 22 and 23, describes the immediate silent aftermath of Babylon's fall.
What's it say?
It says, the sound of harpists, musicians, and flutists will not be heard in you any longer. No craftsman of any trade will be found in you any longer. The light of a lamp will not shine in you any longer, and the voice of the bridegroom and bride will not be heard in you any longer.
There it is again, the brides and bridegrooms. It perfectly mirrors the days of Noah that Jesus described in Matthew 24.
It is the exact same theological pattern. It's the sudden, shocking silencing of everyday joy, industry, and commerce.
It's just gone.
Completely gone. It is divine judgment falling on a society that is living in absolute luxury, entirely convinced of its own invincibility. It heavily parallels the Apostle Paul's warning in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 3.
Remind us of that one.
Paul states that while people are saying peace and safety, destruction will come upon them suddenly, like labor pains upon a pregnant woman.
Wow.
A society can be thriving economically, culturally vibrant, completely engaged in the arts and commerce, and yet be totally blind to the spiritual reality crashing down on them in an instant.
So what does this all mean? How do we take these ancient texts, these first-century warnings to Jewish Christians about Noah, the flood, and the economic collapse of Babylon, and translate them to you, the listener living in the modern world today?
It translates directly because the core of human nature hasn't changed since the days of Noah. Our technology is exponentially more advanced, but our psychological wiring, our vulnerability to normalcy bias, is exactly the same.
Instead of watching Noah build an ark out of gopher wood, we are hyper-focused on our modern equivalents.
Yes, our daily
We are
distractions.
obsessed with our career trajectories, our family schedules, our streaming algorithms, and our retirement portfolios. We get in the car, we go to work, we buy groceries, we come home.
We rely on that routine.
We do. We are totally confident that tomorrow will be exactly like today, simply because yesterday was exactly like today.
This raises an important question for all of us about our own internal barometers for safety. The core theological lesson of this entire source document can be boiled down to a very uncomfortable truth. Normal life does not guarantee safety.
Let me repeat that, because that really is the beating heart of this deep dive. Normal life does not guarantee safety.
We constantly use the mundane routines of our lives as a psychological shield against the heavier, more sobering realities of the universe. We subconsciously believe that because our Google Calendar is full, because we have dinner reservations on Friday night, the universe is somehow obligated to honor our schedule.
We really do think that way.
But what the pivot in Matthew 24 teaches us is that from God's perspective, there is a fixed, perfect, and unyielding schedule.
Just like the 120-year countdown before the floodwaters broke.
Exactly. Just like the exact day and hour that only the Father knows in verse 36, God's timeline is moving forward relentlessly, regardless of whether we are paying attention.
But from the human perspective, specifically from the perspective of those who are completely absorbed by the beast system or simply lulled to sleep by the rhythm of daily life, that exact same fixed schedule appears completely sudden.
It feels like a shock.
It feels like an ambush. Not because God was hiding the reality of it, but because humanity actively chose to look away,
Oh.
choosing the comfort of the mundane over the vigilance required by the signs.
That is the ultimate takeaway of the text. The judgment isn't sudden because it was a spontaneous or erratic decision by God. It is sudden because the human gaze was entirely fixed on the temporal.
Yeah.
We get so caught up in the eating, the drinking, the buying, the selling, and the marrying that we mistake the absence of immediate disaster for the presence of permanent security.
It really reframes how you look at a quiet, uneventful Tuesday morning.
It really does.
And it perfectly encapsulates the journey we've taken through this theological document today. We started with Jesus explicitly warning his disciples about observable, seasonal signs. The wars, the famines, the historical traumas that you can point to.
Warnings.
Exactly. But then we hit that massive jarring pivot in Matthew 24, verse 36, where the focus sharply shifts inward, highlighting the terrifying suddenness of judgment.
That unpredictable hour.
We saw how the days of Noah weren't defined by overt apocalyptic chaos, but by a chilling normalcy, where people simply ignored the warnings until the flood took them away in judgment.
And we explored how the luxury, commerce, and weddings of Babylon will be silenced in a single hour, catching a complacent world entirely by surprise. It is a profound shift from looking outward at global political events to looking inward at our own state of spiritual readiness. The text warns us that the greatest danger isn't just out there in the chaos of the world. The greatest danger might actually be the quiet, comfortable complacency creeping into our own living rooms.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive today. But before we go, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something to explore on your own that builds on everything we've discussed from the source material.
It's an important one.
If the ultimate trap of the end times isn't necessarily participating in some cartoonish comic book level of evil, but is simply being lulled into a deep sleep by the comforting, steady rhythm of normal life, what completely ordinary routines in your own life might be acting as a blindfold to the bigger spiritual picture?
That's a tough question to face.
Could the very things that make you feel the most secure actually be the things keeping you from seeing the reality of God's timeline? It's a heavy question, but one absolutely worth asking.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the pivot of Matthew 24. We appreciate you taking the time to unpack this dense material with us. Keep asking those big questions, keep challenging your own assumptions, and always, always stay curious. We will see you next time.